Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today we're going to be on one of those topics that's often misunderstood in the world of audio and music production, and that is bit depth. I did a podcast episode about sample rates just a few weeks ago. It turned out to be a really popular episode, and a lot of people asked for a similar episode about bit depth. Can we clarify this? Can we clear it up? And I think we can. I think today you're going to get a real coherent sense for what bit depth really is and really determines in a simple way without dumbing it down. At least that's going to be the goal for today. Again, I think this is something that is often misunderstood, in particular because bit depth is often tied up with this word resolution, which I think in this context really isn't the best word to describe what the bit depth is really determining about your audio. So does it make a difference? Should you be working at 16-bit? Should you be working at 24-bit? What's this about 32-bit? Have you heard of 48-bit? Should you be working at higher and higher bit depths? Is 16 enough? Is 24 a good compromise? We're going to answer those questions and more and give you a really good sense for what's really going on under the hood so that you can put this decision to bed once and for all for yourself. Before we get into it, as always, big shout out to the sponsors. Here is your 90 seconds or so of pure bliss as I shout out who am I repping today? Focusrite is on the t-shirt. Big thanks to these guys. As always, when they sponsor the podcast, I love to have them on because I use their stuff every time I'm recording these podcasts. Right behind me is Focusrite Claret 2 Pre, really affordable, well-built, low noise, clean gain, just great bang for the buck interfaces from Focusrite. They also make really high-end stuff if you're looking to network a large installation together. The RedNet series is really interesting for that. It uses Dante. And if you're looking for something really simple for your studio, they make excellent stuff at a variety of price points. In addition to Focusrite, big thanks to Eventide sponsoring once again, making some of the most forward-looking effects in the audio world for about 40 years or more, actually, at this point. They made forward-looking effects in the 1970s, and they're making forward-looking effects today. Really interesting, unusual stuff like Black Hole, like the Mangled Verb, like this whole new series of the structural effects they have where you can tear apart your attack and decay of your single signal and affect each one separately. Really interesting stuff from Eventide. Check out any of the software that they make for free at eventideaudio.com, and they make great hardware, killer guitar effects pedals and the like too. Last, certainly not least, sponsoring once again, Soundtoys. Soundtoys making some of the other most creative plugins in the history of the known universe. Check them out at soundtoys.com. Truly some favorites, and favorites of like so many of the guests that come on the show. So if you haven't checked out Soundtoys yet, please do. If you only have one or two Soundtoys plugins, check out the bundle. It's worth it. Trust me. All right. There it is, your sponsor segment. And now the segment that you've been waiting for, the other segment that you've been waiting for, actually talking about audio stuff. So here we go, bit depth. If you want to go into even more detail on this, I'll link to an article in the show notes I wrote way back in 2013 and still one of the most popular articles on Sonic Scoop every year. It's called Why Almost Everything You Know About Bit Depth is Probably Wrong. And it's a pretty audacious title. Maybe we'll go with a less audacious title for this podcast and just go with something like, most people probably misunderstand bit depth at least a little bit. And I was one of them for the longest time. To be honest, it wasn't until, I'd been in audio for years that I really finally clarified how bit depth operates and got a better understanding of it than what they taught me in college. And I did get a bachelor's degree in doing studio stuff. But honestly, I felt like the academic presentation of bit depth didn't always suss out the practical differences that are really important to us in the studio, at least not the way it was presented to me. And I'll give you some additional great resources so you can hear some of these differences for yourself and determine whether or not they matter for you. So first of all, what is bit depth? If you watch the sample rate episode of the podcast, you may remember that there's really two dimensions in audio, right? We've got time and we've got intensity. And time is what the sample rate takes care of. It determines what the highest frequency that we can record or play back is. And it does that by taking a number of snapshots. So at 44.1K, that's a sample rate that's really common. That means they're taking 44,100 snapshots every second of your audio to start creating a picture of what your audio should sound like. Bit depth is really determining something about the intensity portion of that scale, the loudness, the dynamic range. And if you know a little bit about audio, you probably have a vague understanding of that bit depth is determining how much dynamic range you have. But exactly how it does that is what's unclear for a lot of people. They hear this word resolution, and immediately you start thinking about like the resolution of a digital camera or the resolution of a new big screen TV. And I don't think that's the best way to look at it in the audio world. Lower bit depths don't give this general haze or indistinct, sound to the quality. You don't get higher and higher definition sound by going up in bit depth. What you really get by going up in bit depth is a lower and lower noise floor. It's not quite like adding more pixels to a digital photograph or a digital video. It's not like, going up in the, resolution, the pixel count in, say, YouTube or something like that. It really is basically just determining how loud your noise floor is. And that's pretty much it. Now, you probably know that any component in the world of audio has some kind of a noise floor, whether it's that tape hiss, if you're familiar with old analog formats, or just if you ever cranked up a microphone preamp or a headphone output without even any signal running through it, and you kind of hear the gentle white noise hiss of the electronic circuit. There's noise everywhere. There's noise in the analog domain, there's noise in the digital domain, and interestingly, in the digital domain, even at a relatively low resolution like 16-bit, that noise floor is often dramatically lower than a lot of the analog components we're likely to be working with. So to give you a sense, if you are dealing with 16-bit audio, which has been a standard for consumer playback audio CDs since the late 80s, something like that, 16-bit audio should give you a dynamic range on playback of about 96 dB. How much is that? It's a lot. All right. So even some of the most dynamic, say, classical music recordings or jazz recordings out there really never use 96 dB. If you were to try to think of the noise floor of older analog formats in terms of how many bits you'd need to get that kind of noise floor, I have a little bit of a chart here that explains that. And I have that in that article I mentioned earlier that I'll link to in the show notes. So early 78 RPM records, one of the first consumer formats ever, offered about 30 to 40 dB of dynamic range. And dynamic range, for those of you who don't know, that's the difference between the quietest sound that your medium can capture or play back and the loudest sound that your medium can capture or play back. So old school, vinyl records made out of shellac, actually, back in the really early days, they had about 30 to 40 dB of dynamic range, which translates to a bit depth, effective bit depth, about 5 to 6 bits. Cassette tapes started around 6 bits worth of resolution for about 40 dB of dynamic range. And maybe you could get a little bit better signal to noise on those if you were using high-grade tapes, not doing mass production. So if you were really careful with cassettes and you made the tapes yourself on kind of really nice stock and small batches, you could maybe get out of cassette as much as 70 dB of dynamic range, which is actually quite significant for back then. That's the equivalent that you might have expected out of really decent vinyl. So yes, vinyl, it had an average dynamic range, commercially mass-produced, of about 60 to 70 dB. So it essentially offered about 11 bits worth of resolution. So 16 bits is really higher than pretty much any consumer format before digital audio came around as a consumer format. This 96 dB of headroom, no recordings that you grew up listening to, no classic recordings have ever used that much. And like I said, it would be rare for even a really dynamic classical recording to use 60 dB of dynamic range. That would be, pretty unusual. That'd be really surprising dynamic material. So why does 24-bit exist? Well, 24-bit will give you even more dynamic range to work with than this. And roughly speaking, 24-bit should give you about 144 dB of dynamic range to work with. And that's interesting because that is more than the threshold of pain for human beings. In dB, the quietest sound that we can hear and discern as a sound is usually described as 0 dB. That's how the dB SPL metering scale is usually set up. So the quietest sound you can hear, if that's 0 dB, well, the loudest sound that you can tolerate before you go, ow, it hurts, turn it off, would be about 120 dB. Once you start getting up around 130 dB, you are really risking permanent and possibly even instantaneous hearing loss. So the 144 dB dynamic range of 24-bit is more than we should ever need. It's so loud, in fact, that if you were actually to ever use all of the 144 dB of dynamic range, you could actually really hurt yourself. And I'm serious about this. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet living room and the background noise here is maybe 20 dB, 30 dB, just the ambient noise level. If you were to crank your stereo system loud enough so that you could hear the quietest sounds on a 24-bit medium above the noise floor of your listening environment, so that 0 dB sound, you've already cranked it up so it's louder than the 20 or 30 dB background noise, and then you would actually expose yourself to 144 dB above that, so 160, 170 dB, you could knock yourself unconscious, go instantaneously deaf, and possibly die. So that's how much dynamic range there is in 24-bit. A little bit of overkill, yeah? But that said, that overkill could potentially, plausibly, be a good thing to have when you are tracking so that you have an even bigger window of dynamic range to work with. So here's the argument in favor of recording and working at 24-bit. It basically gives you more room for error. It gives you a bigger window to mess up your gain staging. Like I said, with 16-bit, that window is pretty big. But 144 dB window is even bigger than a 96 dB window. You just have that much more room to basically screw up. So if you have a 16-bit, capture device, you might want to set things so that your highest peaks are not in danger of hitting 0 dBFS, right? Digital 0, that highest level that your digital audio format can handle. You really don't ever want to be touching that. No reason to go there and get distortion on your tracking session, because if you set up your signal so you're almost touching it, there could be an even louder spike that comes through, and then it really distorts, and then you have distortion all over your signal. You can't get off at the end. So you want to set up your signal so that's below the loudest level that you can handle. So maybe you're setting things up so that there's 18 dB, 20 dB, 24 dB of room between your average or even peak signal levels and the maximum signal level that you can handle going in. So now you've actually reduced your effective dynamic range. You only have 60 dB or so to work with before you start hitting that noise floor. So you really have a little bit of a smaller window to work with. And again, that remaining 50 or 60 dB you have to work with is probably more than enough to never worry about the noise floor of your digital medium and to never worry about, peaking too high. But with that said, 24-bit is going to make this window a lot larger. And that is one of the primary arguments in favor of it, particularly at the tracking stage. Now, with all this said, can you capture good audio at 16-bit? Yeah. Do you have to be super duper, incredibly careful about your gain staging? Not really that much. You just have to be reasonably careful about your gain staging. You still have to be less careful about your gain staging, honestly, than you had to be maybe back in the analog days where you might have had less dynamic range to work with, depending on what kind of analog medium you might have been working with. So if 24-bit is such overkill, what is the point of 32-bit? Well, when it comes to recording the tracking stage, there's really no point to 32-bit. I'm going to put it that bluntly, and thankfully so, because as of today, no 32-bit capture devices actually exist. And to be honest with you, in a way, no 24-bit capture devices really exist as of today. In reality, most analog circuits, there's an analog circuit in every A to D converter and every interface that you're ever going to go through. The best kind of performance that you can really expect out of one of these would be a dynamic range of maybe 120 dB in a really well-designed A to D converter or interface. And, that's some, cream of the crop components will get you maybe 120 dB of dynamic range on the analog portion of your A to D converter. That's equivalent to about 20 bits of dynamic range. So in practice, although, pretty much any prosumer or professional or even consumer interface out there on the market is going to have both a 16-bit and a 24-bit mode, the 24-bit modes can't really make use of the full dynamic range of the 24 bits because of the analog side. The digital side is actually even more powerful and works to an even higher standard than the analog side. So you're really only ever using, at best, 20 bits worth of dynamic range in even a really nice converter, and maybe some slightly less nice converters are using less dynamic range than that. And then if you're going through maybe some vintage front end or a nice, analog compressor, or you're going through some character preamp, or you have a microphone that's not super quiet, you're not even using the full 20 bits that your nice high-end converter is theoretically capable of. So it should be pretty obvious in this context that 32-bit for recording doesn't matter, doesn't make a difference, and will only make your file sizes larger for no benefit. Now, with that said, there may be some plausible arguments for using 32-bit bit depths within your DAW. A lot, if not all, native DAWs today use 32-bit floating for audio processing. And some of them may even use 64-bit, at least in certain places. But this doesn't have any effect on the raw sound quality of the audio or the dynamic range you're able to achieve at the mixdown or audio processing stage. I'm going to read a little bit directly from this article I wrote back in 2013 here called Why Almost Everything You Know About Bit Depth Is Probably Wrong. What these super high bit depths do is allow for additional processing without the risk of clipping plugins or buses and without adding super low levels of noise that no one will ever hear. This extra wiggle room lets you do insane amounts of processing and some truly ridiculous things with your levels and gain staging without really thinking twice about it, if that happens to be your kind of thing. And for me, it honestly sometimes is. So I see the allure in that, right? Of being able to not really worry about your gain staging, crank things up, do crazy things, put crazy chains together, not worry about clipping inside of your plugins or buses. Now, to get the benefits of this 32-bit processing, you don't actually need to do anything. Chances are that your DAW already does it, and that almost all of your plugins do it too, without you changing anything. Now, some DAWs, like Pro Tools for instance, also allow the option of creating 32-bit float audio files. But once again, this gives your files no added sound quality or dynamic range. All it does is take your 24-bit audio files and rewrite them in a 32-bit language. In theory, the benefit here is that plugins and other processors don't have to convert your audio back and forth between 24-bit and 32-bit, thereby eliminating any extremely low-level noise from extra dither or quantization errors that no one will ever hear. Because again, the noise floor for 24-bit and 32-bit is so dramatically low that this theoretical advantage of not adding to the noise floor with this conversion back and forth is basically zero. To date, it's not clear whether using 32-bit float audio files is of any real practical benefit when it comes to either noise or processing power. The big trade-off is they do make all of your projects at least 50% larger. But if you have the space and bandwidth to spare for that, it probably can't hurt either. Now, even if there were a slight noise advantage at the microscopic level, it would likely be smaller than the noise contribution of even one piece of super quiet analog gear. Still, if you have the disk space and do truly crazy amounts of processing, why not go for it? You can run some tests of your own, and this is what I always encourage. Listen to this stuff yourself and see and hear if you can tell any differences. On the other hand, if you mix on an analog desk or, using some analog summing, you stand to gain pretty much zero advantage from these types of files, not even a theoretical one, if you're doing all of your processing out in the analog domain. So I mentioned something in this last passage that some people need some clearing up too on, and this would be dither. And I said early on in this episode that basically all the bit depth determines is how low the noise floor is. So what's happening in 16-bit audio is that you have basically 65,000 different slots for each sample of how loud the signal can be. So you've got a given sample, you got 44,000 samples or so in a second. At any given sample, you got 65,000 slots between negative infinity and 0 dBFS, the top of the meter. 65,000 slots where it can wind up. Now, if your actual analog signal coming in is between one of these slots, which is likely to be, it'll get rounded up or rounded down to the next nearest slot. And these rounding errors are called quantization errors, and they basically render as noise. The exact mechanisms by which this occurs is a little hard to explain in this context and at this length, but just let it be known that when you're going from analog to digital, there are slight rounding errors in amplitude that are rendered as extremely low-level noise. Now, the one trick here is that this low-level noise is not perfectly white noise like you might get out of a tape machine or an analog piece of gear. Not by default, anyway. If you really crush down the bit depths of something to like 2 bits or 3 bits, and you start hearing this noise, you'll hear it can have a kind of almost resonant, fuzzy characteristic in a very subtle way that can be a little bit more apparent than traditional white noise. So what Dither does is it smooths this noise and basically turns it into white noise. So what Dither is doing is basically making this noise more even, more like white noise. And it can actually go one step further than that and apply some shaping to the noise. So you may know that our hearing is much more sensitive around the mid-range and upper mid-range than it is at the extreme highs and the extreme lows. So what some of these Dither algorithms will do is take this noise, instead of making completely white flat noise, it'll shift it up so that you have a little bit more of that noise happening in the super high frequencies that are really hard to hear, especially at low levels, maybe a tiny bit more at the lower frequencies that are harder to hear at these low levels, and you'll have a bit of a dip in the noise in the parts of the frequency spectrum that are the easiest to hear, particularly at low levels. But to be honest, even at 16-bit, the differences between dither types are really hard to hear because they're so darn low. They're roughly 96 dB or so below the loudest possible sound. So if you're listening at normal levels, the chances of you ever hearing the effect of dither are slim to almost zero. Had we settled on a consumer format that was closer to consumer idioms of the old times, like, 10 bits or 11 bits, which is what you might have gotten at a really good vinyl, or lower than that, then maybe if we had 8-bit or 10-bit or 11-bit audio as a standard and we had settled on that to save even more space, maybe dither would have mattered more and that noise shaping would have mattered more, because maybe the noise floor would be loud enough that you'd kind of notice it, and some of this dither and shaping would be really helpful. With 8-bit audio, there's a lot less question that the noise floor could be apparent, and dither and different types of dither could really make a difference for you. But at a bit depth like 16-bit or above, you're really not going to hear the noise floor to begin with. So if you actually forget to dither something at 16-bit, you'll probably be basically fine. At 24-bit, there's even less of a concern because, again, that noise floor is 144 dB down. Now, I'm not telling you not to dither. It's still a good practice to dither. But I will tell you this. Listening at normal levels, basically no one can hear the difference between 16 and 24-bit. If you have a properly mastered file, so you're using, all of your bits and the peaks are, just a little bit below 0 dBFS, and you have appropriate levels of dynamic range, really no one, even trained golden ears at normal listening levels, are ever going to hear the difference between 16-bit and 24-bit. The way that I or anyone else could kind of cheat a listening test and hear the difference between 16-bit and 24-bit would be to crank up our system super duper loud so that if we played things straight out and like blow up the speakers. So we're listening really, really loud. And then we could listen to like the fading tail end of like a really quiet violin part, fading out. And then maybe there we could hear the dither. But we'd have to crank up our level so high to hear that difference in noise floor that it wouldn't be practical to actually listen to music at those levels. So just to clarify a little bit more on the 32-bit thing, yes, 32-bit is useful for processing. Having 32-bit audio processing is great because it gives you even more dynamic range, an even bigger window to not worry about clipping your buses, not worry about clipping your plugins. So that 32-bit floating point kind of setup is really great. However, you do not have to use 32-bit floating point audio files to get those benefits. It's going to be done automatically in most DAWs and in most plugins that are written properly. The argument in favor of using 32-bit audio files, which some DAWs you can do, like Pro Tools, you can set up your session at 32-bit audio files, is that you wouldn't have to worry about additional quantization errors and additional noise from changing back and forth between 24-bit and 32-bit. But again, the volume levels of that dither or of those quantization errors going back and forth between 24 and 32 are likely to be so incredibly low that no one is ever going to hear them. So that benefit isn't huge. There is one nice possible benefit, say in Pro Tools, of using the 32-bit audio file function that I can think of off the top of my head. If you can think of others, please let me know in the comments below. But the one thing I can think of is the clip gain function in Pro Tools. You can raise the clip gain on an audio file past the point where it should be clipping in a 32-bit session, and it won't clip. So those advantages of not clipping things wouldn't apply only to plugins written in 32-bit, wouldn't apply to only buses that are running under the hood at 32-bit, but would also additionally apply to the audio files themselves. If you're doing direct processing on the audio files, you can get away with being sloppier there without getting clipping, boosting the clip gain too high, maybe doing some audio suite processing, that kind of thing. So those are the two potential benefits of working at 32-bit on the audio post-processing stage. Is it necessary? Absolutely not. Is it going to improve your sound quality? Probably not, and not necessarily. Maybe, arguably, if you're doing insanely crazy things, maybe. Is it worth an additional 50% file size and some additional processing power? You be the judge on that. And as always, I encourage you to do listening tests. This should be a really easy one to do. You can do a whole mix session at 24-bit and then save it out as a 32-bit session. Bounce to disk again, compare those two mixes, test them double blind and see if one sounds better than the other. My guess here is that you are going to say, no, it makes no difference. I'd rather save the, not go up an additional 50% in how quickly I'm burning through hard drives. I'm going to guess that that's going to be your answer, but to find out for yourself, I always encourage you to do that kind of test. Really easy to do, particularly in a platform like Pro Tools. Man, since people are going to ask, I guess I should say something about 48-bit. I'll read again remarks from this article because I think I put it pretty concisely here. Years ago, Pro Tools, probably the most popular professional level DAW in America, used a format called 48-bit fixed point for its TDM line. Like 32-bit floating, this was a processing format and had pretty much nothing to do with audio capture, playback, or effective dynamic range. The big difference between this and 32 floating point was how it handled digital overs or clipping. 32-bit floating point is a little bit more forgiving when it comes to internal clipping and level setting. The trade-off is that it has a potentially higher and less predictable noise floor than 48-bit. So although the noise floor of 48-bit fixed processing was likely to be even lower and more consistent than 32-bit, the price was that you'd have to be slightly more rigorous about setting your levels in order to avoid internal clipping of plugins and buses. In the end, the difference between the two noise floors was basically inaudible to human beings at all practical levels, so for simplicity's sake, 32-bit won out the day. I mean, that makes sense, right? If 48-bit has a really, really low noise floor, 32-bit has a really, really low noise floor, and the difference between those two noise floors are basically indistinguishable to anyone ever, the format that's a little easier to work with, 32-bit, which is harder to clip because of the floating point system, is the one that won out the day. So although these differences were so negligible, arguing about which one was better took up countless hours for audio forum nerds who probably could have made much better use of that time making records or potentially trying to have a social life of some kind. All right, that's about it. If you were anything like me, you did not know all of this stuff, even many years potentially into your career in audio. And that's okay, because honestly, you don't need to understand this stuff with a great degree of depth or clarity to make good sounding records. I think there are a lot of people out there who assume that higher and higher resolutions must be better. But the reality is that there are limits to our human perception. And those limits to our human perception in hearing, we run into them a lot quicker than we run into the limits of digital audio files and digital systems for recording and playing back audio. So when it comes to audio and when it comes to bit depth, honestly, 16-bit, definitely good enough for consumer playback. Better than any consumer playback format that's ever existed, demonstrably so. 16-bit should be good enough for digital capture, even if you're a little sloppy with setting your levels. But 24-bit may be even safer, just because you can be even sloppier with setting your levels and not have to worry about running into the noise floor. Whether you're at 16-bit or 24-bit has no effect on how hot you can go with your level. It has an effect on how quiet you can go with recording your level before you run into hitting that noise floor. But thankfully, in both 16-bit and 24-bit, it's so low that if you mistakenly do a session at 16-bit, it's probably fine. Similarly, if you end up mixing at 16-bit instead of 24-bit or bouncing out a 16-bit file instead of 24-bit and sending it to your mastering engineer, no big deal. I just the other week had a client said, "Oh man, I just sent you a 16-bit file. I can't believe I captured a 16-bit file. I'm going to have to go back and remix the whole thing. And part of it's on an analog system. You have to recall it." And I basically told him the truth, which is that it doesn't make that much of a difference. If it's super easy for you to recall and you can bounce out a 24-bit file for me to work from, that's a best practice. But honestly, the only difference there is going to be the noise floor. And assuming you're not bouncing out this file at a super crazy low noise floor, you're going to be fine. Particularly knowing that most of your plugins and processing are actually happening at a higher bit rate than the one advertised as being the bit rate of the session. So again, this is not something to be too precious about. Now, I'd say in the early days of digital audio didn't sound that great for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was the anti-aliasing filters wasn't as good. One of the big reasons that people don't talk about enough is that the analog front end to a lot of these digital devices weren't as good yet. The analog to digital converters weren't as good. There's a lot of things that weren't as good. And I think people would mistakenly attribute the shortcomings in early digital audio to the format, to the bit depth and the sample rate. When the reality is, it wasn't the format, the bit depth and the sample rate that was the weak link for early digital audio. It was, generally speaking, the hardware devices that people were using to capture their digital audio. And in many cases, it could be the analog components in those devices. And even today, we have not created audio capture devices that are capable of using the full dynamic range of 24-bit audio files. And that's okay, because honestly, who wants to get smacked in the ear with 144 dB of noise coming at you? If you do, I hope you're wearing some of those big air traffic controller earmuffs. I hope you know it's coming, and I hope they don't get blown off of your head, because ouch, that would hurt. All right, I hope that's demystified some of bit depth for you. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today we have been sponsored by Sound Toys. They make incredibly awesome effects. Check them out at soundtoys.com. If you don't own the whole Sound Toys 5 bundle, you should. If you want some a la carte plugins, go get them. They make absolutely great stuff. So does our other big sponsor for today, Eventide. Eventide making some of the most creative, interesting, and forward-looking effects in the history of the known universe, making very cool hardware, very cool stomp box, and very cool software plugin effects. Really, really excellent company. Check them out, eventideaudio.com. Been sponsoring this podcast for a long time. Big fans of them. And another big thank you to a maker of fine interfaces, Focusrite. Focusrite making some really clean, reliable, stable, durable, amazing bang for the buck interfaces and preamps. I use a Claret 2 pre every time I record this podcast. I've been super happy with it. Really great high quality stuff. If you're in the market for an interface, check them out. They make really inexpensive stuff. Their Scarlett line. They make really good, affordable pro stuff. Their Claret line. They make some great 8-channel interfaces with or without dynamics built in. Preamps that you can add on, the Octapre. You can get some really high-end stuff like the RedNet series for networking together huge rooms. So check them out at Focusrite.com. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. And please, if you have not already, subscribe. Subscribe to this on YouTube. Subscribe to us on Spotify. Subscribe on Google Play. Subscribe on iTunes. And if you liked this episode, if you dug the message that we're getting out there, if you thought this was informative, please give us a like, give us a comment, give us a rating or review. And if you have questions you want answered, I want to hear them. Write to me at podcast@sonicscoop.com. Is there an episode that you'd like to hear us do? Is there a topic you want to see covered? Let me know. Podcast@sonicscoop.com, or type into the comments at YouTube, type into the comments on Facebook. And like I said, subscribe, give us a rating. It really does help more people discover the podcast. So thanks one last and final time. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop coming at you from my home studio. See you next time.